Night 47. The first night in 46 that Elias slept through until morning, and Clara stayed awake in the chair beside the stove, watching the candle fail, and writing numbers in her ledger that refused to balance no matter how many times she added them. She would tell this story differently, depending on the year she told it, but she always started here with this night with the quiet and the cold, and her husband's breathing coming slow, and even from the back room for the first time since November. She started here because everything that came after the digging, the smoke, the weeks of failure, the single afternoon that changed how 43 families survived the winters that followed, everything began not with an act of courage, but with a man finally exhausted enough to sleep. The cabin sat at the edge of a settlement called Harrow Flats, 3 hours by wagon east of Stillwater, Minnesota, and it was modest even by the standards of the frontier in 1887. 20 feet by 18 walls of hand-notched pine sealed with mud chinking and packed straw, a floor of rough-cut boards laid over bare earth, two small windows, covered for winter, with oiled paper stretched taut across the frames because glass was a cost that had been deferred for 2 seasons running and would be deferred for one more. The roof held. That was what Elias said when anyone asked about the cabin. The roof holds. He said it the way a man recites a prayer, not because it solves anything, but because saying it keeps the problem from growing larger than it already is. The stove stood in the center of the main room, cast iron 4 feet tall, 3 feet wide at its widest point, with geometric patterns pressed into its surface during the casting and ornamental feet, shaped like the paws of some animal that had never actually lived in Minnesota. Elias had waited once on a slow winter morning when the cold had made sleep impossible, and the need to understand the mathematics of their situation had overtaken every other need. 412 pounds. He had recorded the number in Clara's ledger, next to the cost of the stove, $11 purchased secondhand from a family in Stillwater who had upgraded to something newer, as if knowing exactly how heavy a thing was might somehow make it easier to carry. Within 6 feet of its surface, the heat was real and pressing and almost violent in its intensity. The iron glowed a deep cherry red when the fire was strong, and standing directly beside it, you could forget for a few minutes that outside the cabin the world had become a place actively hostile to human survival. Beyond 6 feet, the warmth diminished in a way that felt personal. By 10 feet, it was gone. By 12 feet, the distance to the doorway of the bedroom where Daniel and Mabel slept, the thermometer on the interior wall read between 35 and 38 degrees, which was cold enough that breath came out in visible clouds, and the water in the pitcher on the washstand sometimes developed a thin skin of ice by morning. The stove heated the room it was supposed to heat and almost nothing beyond it, and it accomplished this by consuming wood at a rate that Clara's ledger tracked with the grim precision of someone who has understood for weeks that the line between current consumption and total depletion is shorter than the remaining winter. Elias Morrow was 45 years old that winter, and he looked it and then some. He had come to Minnesota from a small town in central Ohio in 1879 with $40 a two-man crosscut saw and the kind of confidence that belongs specifically to men who have not yet discovered what they are truly capable of being defeated by. His father had been a blacksmith, and from his father he had inherited large hands, a tolerance for discomfort, and an almost theological patience in the face of problems that required repeated attempts before yielding. What his father had not passed on, what Elias had developed entirely on his own, through a combination of temperament and circumstance, was a stubbornness so complete and so structural that it functioned less like a character trait and more like a load-bearing wall. Once Elias Morrow had decided on a direction, the question of whether that direction was correct became almost irrelevant. He would continue. He would continue past the point of reason, and past the point of diminishing returns, and past the point where continuation itself became a kind of damage because stopping felt to him like a verdict he was not willing to accept. This was his greatest strength in the early years of farming and homesteading, when persistence was the primary currency and the problems were mostly problems of physical effort. It would become something more complicated in the winter of 1887. Clara was 3 years younger than her husband and had come from a different world, or at least a different version of the same world. She had taught elementary school in Columbus, Ohio for 4 years before she married Elias, and she brought with her to Minnesota a habit of mind that was fundamentally incompatible with wishful thinking. She kept records of everything, food consumed, and food remaining, money spent, and money remaining, firewood burned, and firewood remaining. She tracked the temperature on the interior wall thermometer every morning and every evening, and recorded both readings in the same ledger where she kept the household accounts, so that over time the ledger had become a document of remarkable density, a record not just of what things cost, but of exactly how cold it had been on every morning of every winter since 1881, and what that cold had required of them in terms of fuel and food, and the specific physical effort of keeping 5 people alive. She had been a school teacher, and she had never entirely stopped being one. Her children had grown up understanding that ignorance was not a comfortable resting place in Clara Morrow's house. It was a temporary condition to be corrected as quickly as possible. The silence she used when she had run out of patience was not the silence of surrender. He had read every book in the cabin, which was not a great number, and had then read several of them again, including a text on mechanical principles that had belonged to his paternal grandfather, and that contained, among other things, a chapter on heat transfer in industrial furnaces that Daniel had read 4 times and understood better than anyone in the county could have tested him on. He wanted to leave Harrow Flats, not permanently or not necessarily permanently, but he wanted to go to Stillwater and learn a trade that involved more than the seasonal repetition of farming, and this desire sat inside him through that winter like a small coal banked and patient, generating a low and steady warmth. He did not speak of it much. The winter was not a season for speaking of futures that required the present to first be survived. Mabel was 14 and kept a journal in a cloth sack hidden under the mattress of the bed she shared with no one, because the bedroom was cold enough that having the bed to herself was not a luxury, but a sentence. The journal was not a diary in the sentimental sense. It was a record modeled on her mother's ledger, but broader in scope: temperature readings, observations about frost and the behavior of the animals in the small barn, notes on her father's energy levels, and her mother's eating habits, and her brother's sleeping patterns. She wrote the way her mother taught, precisely without decoration, with a preference for the specific over the general. She would record a temperature before she would record a feeling, but when she did record a feeling, it carried the weight of everything she had not said. The numbers in Clara's ledger that January told a story that did not have a comfortable ending. The family's total income for 1887 would come to approximately $180, a combination of what the farm produced, what Elias earned doing day labor for neighboring properties during the warmer months, and a small amount from the sale of excess vegetables in late summer. Against this, the costs of survival were relentless. Food staples consumed the largest portion, seeds for the spring planting, repairs that could not be deferred, medicine when medicine became necessary, and heat. Heat was the line item that had been growing every winter since 1884, not because the winters were necessarily colder, but because the cabin had been settling for 6 years, and the chinking between the logs was no longer as tight as it had once been, and cold air moved through gaps with the same quiet determination that water finds its way through any imperfect seal. At the beginning of that winter, Claire had budgeted for 4 cords of firewood at 30 cents per cord. By the middle of January, they had burned through 7, and the winter showed no sign of breaking. The stove required feeding every 2 hours through the night. A single cord lasted 8 days instead of the 12 she had projected. The stove converted perhaps a third of the wood's energy into heat that stayed in the room. The other 2/3 went up the chimney as exhaust, carrying warmth up through the iron pipe and out through the roof and into the Minnesota winter as completely and as uselessly as if they had simply burned the wood in an open field. This was not a defect in the stove. It was the nature of the technology. Every wood stove in every cabin, in every settlement, from Harrow Flats to the Canadian border, operated on the same principle and the same mathematics. The frontier was cold, and the tools available to address that cold were imperfect, and the gap between what the tools could do and what survival required was filled by human labor and human endurance. And when those ran short by the slow particular damage that chronic cold inflicts on the bodies of people who cannot escape it, Daniel had stopped sleeping fully. He woke multiple times each night, not because of the cold beside the stove, he was warm enough, but because the fire required tending, and he had developed the light, watchful sleep of someone who understands that their job is not to rest, but to monitor. Clara had stopped eating breakfast 3 weeks into January. She did this without announcement or explanation, sliding her portion to Elias's plate. In the moments before he turned from the washstand, a transfer so practiced by mid-January that it had become nearly invisible. Mabel noticed. She said nothing. She recorded it in the journal instead, January 9th. Mother did not eat breakfast again. Father did not notice. I will keep watching. The observation carried no judgment. That was perhaps the most unsettling thing about it. Daniel noticed on January 11th. He came into the main room early and found his mother at the stove and watched her move her portion without a word, and something tightened in his face that he controlled before she could see it. Later that morning when they were alone, he faced her across the kitchen and let the weight of what he'd observed settle between them before speaking. You have to eat, Ma. Clara continued what she was doing with her hands and answered without turning. I eat plenty. He did not move. I watch the portions. A long pause and then her voice with less edge and more weight than the first answer. Then worry about your own. He understood then that this was not a conversation she was willing to have, which meant she had already weighed the available options and made a decision that could not be unmade by his concern, only perhaps by the situation that had required it changing. He went back to the kitchen. He ate everything on his plate that morning. On the morning of January the 12th, Elias found the crack. It ran along the east wall of the cabin at roughly chest height, starting near the corner where the wall met the chimney and extending approximately 4 feet toward the window. It was not a crack in the logs themselves. It was in the chinking, the packed mixture of mud and straw and clay that filled the gaps between the logs and kept the wind from passing straight through the wall as through a sieve. The chinking had been drying and contracting and freezing and expanding through 6 winters, and it had finally begun to fail. A section, roughly the length and width of a man's forearm, had separated from the wood on either side and was pulling away in pieces, leaving a gap through which, if you pressed your eye close enough in the right light, you could see daylight on the other side. Elias stood in front of the crack for a long time without touching it. He pressed the palm of his hand over the gap and felt the cold seeping through like water, through cupped fingers, constant, indifferent without any particular hostility, but without any mercy either. The wind outside was not especially strong that morning. This was not a crisis caused by extraordinary weather. This was ordinary Minnesota January, doing ordinary work on an ordinary cabin, and the cabin was losing. He checked the rest of the east wall and found 2 more separations smaller earlier in their progression, but following the same pattern. He checked the north wall and found 1 more. The cabin was not failing at a single point. It was failing along its entire northern and eastern exposure, in a slow, simultaneous deterioration that had been building since the first hard freeze of November and would continue until either the chinking was replaced or the walls gave way entirely. Replacing the chinking properly required materials he did not have. Fresh clay, dry straw, the specific window of weather that allowed the mixture to set before the next freeze. The materials alone would cost approximately $8. He stood in front of the crack for a long time doing arithmetic that had no solution, and then he went to find Clara. She listened to everything without interrupting, and when he finished, she opened the ledger to the current page, and they both looked at the numbers together for a moment without speaking. There was no $8. There was no version of the current budget in which $8 appeared without removing something else that was also necessary. Clara wrote the number down anyway, $8 east and north wall chinking, and closed the ledger, and they stood in the kitchen in the cold that was not cold enough to kill them immediately, but was cold enough to be killing them slowly, and neither of them said the thing they were both thinking because saying it would not change the arithmetic. That evening, Roland Bjork appeared at the door just past 9 o'clock, which was late enough that his appearance alone communicated that something was wrong. He was a large man, broader than Elias, with a face that the Minnesota winters had worked on in the particular way they worked on men who spent more time outside than inside, weathered past age. The skin thickened and creased the eyes, carrying a specific quality of flatness that came from years of looking at horizons that had repeatedly failed to contain good news. He stood in the doorway long enough for Clara to call from the back room to close the door, and then he came inside and sat at the table and accepted the cup of coffee that Clara brought him without asking whether he wanted it, because asking would have been a waste of time. 2 cattle and a goat, he told them, found in the barn that morning when he went to feed. They had simply stopped sometime in the night, and by the time Roland reached them, the cold had already begun its work ice in the lungs and the joints locked in the final position of whatever the animal had been doing when its systems gave out. He had left them outside in the yard because the ground was too frozen to dig and there was nothing else to do, and he had walked to the Morrow cabin because he did not want to be alone with what three animals dying quietly in a barn looked like when you found them hours later. Elias sat across from him and said the things that needed to be said. Then the two men sat in silence with their coffee, and Elias looked at Roland's face and found what he had been afraid he might find. It was not grief exactly, and it was not anger. It was something past both of those, a settling, a flattening of expectation, the expression of a man who has been keeping a private set of books and has finally arrived at an answer he can no longer dispute. Roland had stopped calculating what was possible and had begun calculating what was lost. And the difference between those two calculations was the difference between a man still in the fight and a man who had accepted the terms of defeat and was working out how to live with them. This was the look Elias had been afraid of seeing, and seeing it on someone else's face clarified with sudden force what it would mean to see it in a mirror. Elias walked Roland to the door an hour later and watched him disappear into the dark between the trees, and he stood in the cold with his breath coming in white clouds, and he made a decision that was not yet a plan but was more solid than a hope. He would not arrive at that arithmetic. Whatever it required, whatever act of stubbornness or ingenuity or outright refusal to accept the available options was necessary, he would do it. He went back inside and banked the fire and lay down beside Clara, and was still awake 2 hours later when she slipped out to take her turn at the stove. The temperature dropped to 22 below zero on January the 13th. Mabel recorded this in her journal alongside the observation that the interior wall thermometer had read 31 degrees at 6 in the morning, which was 7 degrees colder than the same reading the previous week. She also recorded that her father had not eaten his full portion at supper, and that her mother had added his leftovers to the pot for tomorrow's breakfast without comment, which meant her mother had noticed and had made the same calculation Mabel had made, which was that pointing it out would accomplish nothing except giving Elias something additional to carry. The idea did not arrive in a flash. Ideas of genuine consequence rarely do. What happened was this: on the evening of January the 14th, after supper, after Daniel had taken his blanket to the kitchen and settled beside the stove, after Mabel had retreated to the bedroom with the journal and the grandmother's thermometer she kept on the floor to track overnight lows, Elias sat in the chair nearest the stove and stared at the floor. He had been sitting there for perhaps 20 minutes, not thinking about anything in particular, when he pressed his hand flat against the floorboards, the way a man will sometimes press a hand against the surface just to confirm that it exists. The floor was cold. That was not surprising, but it was less cold than the air at knee height, not dramatically less. Perhaps 4 or 5 degrees less. The difference was there, and Elias had the habit of noticing differences, and once he noticed it, he could not unnotice it. The floor was warmer than the surrounding air because the earth beneath it had stored somewhere in its mass a residue of warmth from the summer months. The earth did not cool and heat at the same rate as air. The earth was slow. It remembered seasons. Even here in January, with the surface frozen to a depth that resisted a pickaxe, the deeper ground held something, not warmth exactly, but something less than the killing cold of the air above it. Elias sat with this observation for a while without doing anything with it. Then a question arrived, the kind that announces itself quietly and then refuses to leave. The stove heated the air. The air went up. The heat went with it, rising to the ceiling, pressing against the roof, finding the gaps and escaping into the night. The stove stood on the floor and radiated outward in all directions equally, which meant that roughly half of its energy went sideways and upward and ultimately out of the room, while the floor beneath it was warmed not directly, but only by the ambient temperature of the air, which was always insufficient. What if the stove were below the floor? He did not say it aloud. He sat with it for several minutes, first turning it over, looking for the obvious reason why it was impossible, the reason that would have occurred to anyone who had tried it before, and explained why no one ever had. The reasons were not difficult to find. A buried stove would require a chimney that traveled underground before rising above the roofline. It would require air intake from outside. It would require some mechanism by which the heat generated below the floor could cross the distance between the stove and the living space above. These were not trivial engineering problems. They were the kind of problems that required knowledge he did not possess, and materials he could not afford, and expertise that did not exist within 3 days' travel of Harrow Flats. He went to find paper anyway. Clara was in the bedroom, sitting up against the wall with her mending in her lap, because the lamp oil was too expensive to burn for the luxury of sewing in the main room. Elias stood into the doorway and said he had an idea, and Clara set down the mending and looked at him for a moment with the particular evaluating attention she brought to anything her husband described as an idea, an attention calibrated by years of experience with the range of what those words had historically contained. He explained it as clearly as he could, which was not very clearly, because he did not yet have the language for what he was imagining. He drew a rough diagram on the back of an envelope with a carpenter's pencil, a cross-section of the cabin, the floor represented by a horizontal line, the stove drawn as a rectangle below that line, row arrows indicating heat rising through the earth, and the boards into the room above. The diagram looked, he had to admit, like something a child might draw to illustrate a story that made no physical sense. Clara studied the envelope for a long time. Then she set it on the bed between them and looked at her husband and gave him what honesty required in the plainest terms available to her. "That is the most insane thing I have ever heard you say, and you have said some genuinely insane things." The wind moved through the trees outside with a sound like distant water. A pause and then something else. "But tell me why it wouldn't work." This was not the same as saying it would work. Elias understood the distinction. He also understood what it meant that she was asking the question instead of closing the conversation, which was that some part of Clara's mind had already begun examining the idea and had not found the immediate fatal flaw she was looking for. She gave him 3 conditions before she would agree to let the project move forward. First, the total material cost could not exceed $5, which was the absolute outer limit of what could be redirected from the remaining household budget without compromising food stores or medicine against genuine emergency. Second, if the first attempt failed, Elias would stop for 1 full week and they would evaluate together before proceeding. Third, Daniel's participation had to be voluntary. He would not be told to help, he would be asked, and if he declined, Elias would not press him. 3 conditions. Elias agreed to all 3, and Clara knew him well enough to understand that agreeing and keeping were related, but distinct activities when Elias Morrow was the one agreeing. She recorded the conditions in the ledger anyway in her neat schoolteacher's hand, as if writing them down might give them the force of contract. She would think about those 3 written lines many times over the following weeks, each time one of them was quietly broken. That night, after the cabin had gone quiet, Mabel lay in the dark with the journal open on her chest and the pencil in her hand, and she wrote by feel because no light was worth burning on words. She wrote, "He slept. For the first time in 47 nights, my father slept like a man who has somewhere to go in the morning. I sat in the doorway for a while and watched him. I don't know if that is a good sign or a bad sign. I suppose I will find out." The morning of January the 15th came in at 17 below zero and overcast with a wind from the northwest that moved the oiled paper over the windows in a slow breathing motion. Elias was awake before dawn, lying still in the dark, doing the calculations he had refused to do the night before because doing them then would have made sleep impossible, and he had needed sleep. Now he did them. The pit would need to be approximately 6 feet deep to position the stove below the frost line and give the surrounding earth enough thermal mass to hold and radiate heat upward. The walls of the pit would need reinforcement. Loose earth would collapse inward under 412 pounds of cast iron. The chimney would need to rise at an angle steep enough to create sufficient draft. The air intake would need to come from outside the cabin to prevent the fire from consuming the oxygen in the living space. Each of these requirements was addressable. None of them was easy. He made breakfast while Clara slept. The result was imperfect in the way that things made by people who do not typically make them are imperfect. But it was hot and it was food, and Clara came out to the main room to find it on the table, and her husband standing by the stove with a cup of coffee and a look on his face that she had not seen in several months. Not confidence exactly. Something smaller and more reliable than confidence. The specific expression of a person who has converted anxiety into agenda. Daniel came in from the kitchen when he smelled the food and sat down and ate without speaking, which was his way in the mornings. It was not until he had nearly finished that Elias set down his coffee and asked whether his son had time that morning to help him start something. Daniel looked at his father. Elias explained what he was proposing briefly without embellishment, watching his son's face the way you watch a glass filling to see how much room is left. Daniel listened and asked two questions, one about the angle of the chimney relative to the cabin floor, one about how the air intake would prevent backdraft into the living space, and both questions were better questions than Elias had prepared answers for. Then Daniel pushed back his chair and said he would help, and that was the entire negotiation. The first problem presented itself within 20 minutes of taking a pickaxe to the cabin floor. Elias had pulled up 3 boards in a section of the main room, roughly 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, exposing the bare earth beneath, and he raised the pickaxe and brought it down with everything he had, and the pickaxe rebounded from the frozen ground like it had struck iron, then impact traveling up the handle through his wrists and into his shoulders with a violence that left his hands ringing. The earth was mechanically fused, not softened by the cabin's warmth above it, but frozen solid to a depth that made the first blow look like a man arguing with a mountain. He stood looking at the single small gouge the strike had made perhaps an inch deep, and understood that if this continued at this rate, the pit would not be finished before spring. He thought about it for a moment. Then he called for Clara, and she came and looked at the gouge in the frozen earth, and they stood together considering it, and then Clara said the thing neither of them had thought to think first. Heat it first. She meant the earth itself. Boil water and pour it in rows along the perimeter of the section, let it soak into the ground and break the frost's hold before attacking with the pickaxe. It would cost fuel to heat the water, but it would cost far more in time and in the physical damage of repeated futile blows to keep striking at earth that simply refused to yield. They spent the next 3 hours heating water on the stove and pouring it in careful rows along the marked section, then waiting, then pouring more. Steam rose from the ground in thin wisps. By mid-morning, the surface had softened enough that the pickaxe went in 4 inches on the first blow, and after that the work was possible, not easy, but possible, which was a different category entirely. Daniel worked beside his father. He was younger and had the resilience of a body still absorbing punishment rather than accumulating it, but even he felt the work in his shoulders by noon. They dug in shifts, one on the pickaxe while the other cleared, loosened earth with a flat shovel trading off every 20 minutes. Without discussion, the rhythms settling naturally between them. By early afternoon, they had reached a depth of 2 feet. The earth at 2 feet was less fully frozen than the surface. Not warm, not yielding, but penetrable without the boiling water preparation the top layers had required. Progress accelerated marginally. They ate lunch standing up, bread and cold beans, drinking water that had been heated on the stove, because cold water in this temperature cost the body too much to process. It was sometime in the middle of the afternoon when they had reached 2.5 feet, and Elias was clearing spoil from the edges, while Daniel worked the pickaxe that his son stopped without warning, and straightened up and looked down at what they had made. There was a long pause, the specific pause of someone organizing a thought that needs to arrive complete or not at all, and then, "You're digging a hole. You know how to dig a hole, but this isn't a hole yet. You haven't decided what it is." No accusation in it and no criticism. It was an observation in the same tone Daniel used to note a temperature reading, carrying information rather than judgment. Elias set down the shovel. He looked at his son, who was looking at the rectangular excavation in the cabin floor, with the expression of someone reading a text and noticing an error in the logic that the author had missed. Daniel crouched at the edge of the pit and picked up a piece of the loosened earth and turned it in his hands. The heat from the stove radiates outward in every direction. That's why standing 6 feet away is warm and 12 feet away is cold. Heat moves through air. But if you bury the stove in packed earth, the heat has to move through something completely different. It has to move through dirt and dirt and clay don't conduct heat the same way air does. He put the earth down and looked at the pit. You haven't decided yet how you want the heat to move, so you're digging a shape that doesn't know what it's for. Elias sat down on the edge of the pit with his legs hanging over the side and was quiet for long enough that Daniel gave him the specific attention young people give to adults who have gone silent in the middle of a problem. Then out of the stillness, a single word came from somewhere between certainty and surrender. "Show me." Daniel retrieved the envelope with the original diagram from the pocket of his father's coat hanging by the door. He crouched beside Elias at the pit's edge, and they both looked at the cross-section drawing together the line of the floor, the rectangle of the stove below it, the arrows pointing upward. Daniel took the pencil from his father's coat pocket and began modifying the diagram. He added density notations around the stove. He drew arrows not just pointing upward, but circulating, rising along the sides of the stove, traveling along the underside of the floorboards, cooling and descending back toward the fire in a cycle that was not a straight line, but a loop, a circulation, a system, rather than a simple transfer. Elias looked at the modified diagram for a long time. He had been thinking about heat as a substance that moved from one place to another like water flowing downhill. His son was showing him something different. Heat was a behavior. It moved through mediums in ways that were specific to those mediums, and what worked in air would not work in packed clay, and the design needed to account for this from the beginning rather than discovering it after the fact. He had been thinking about this wrong. Not wrong in a way that made the idea impossible, wrong in a way that made the current design insufficient, which was a different and more correctable problem. "We need to change the shape," Elias said, the words arriving with the particular flatness of a man accepting a revision he didn't anticipate. Daniel nodded. "And the material around the stove? And probably the chimney angle." A pause. "But not today. Today we finish the depth." They worked until the light failed. By the time Clara called them in for supper, they had reached 4 feet with one wall, already showing the slight color change in the soil that indicated a shift in mineral composition, darker at the surface, lightening to something almost amber at depth. The earth at 4 feet was noticeably different from the earth at 2 feet, less fused, more granular, holding the marks of the pickaxe rather than throwing it back. The deeper earth was not warm, but it was less hostile. It was beginning just barely to be workable on its own terms. They ate supper without speaking much. Mabel had made the meal a soup of dried beans and salt pork with cornbread, and she served it and sat and watched her father and brother eat with the focused inward attention of someone studying evidence. She did not ask questions. She would write it down later, all of it. She would write the depth of the pit and the color of the soil at 4 feet, and the fact that both men ate everything on their plates and asked for the remaining cornbread, and ate that too, which was the first time in 2 weeks either of them had eaten past adequacy. She retrieved the envelope from the edge of the pit while the men were still eating and examined it in the lamplight, her father's original drawing on one side and on the other layered over it in the same pencil, but in a denser, more precise hand, a second diagram she recognized as her brother's, even though she had never seen him draw a diagram before. She put the envelope back between the 2 cups on the table. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 14 below. Inside, the stove was burning steadily, and the room was 41 degrees, and for the first time in several weeks, there was a specific reason to believe that 41 degrees was not the final answer to the question of how warm this cabin was going to get. Mabel sat at the table after supper with the journal open and the pencil in her hand, and for a while she did not write anything. She looked at her father and her brother bent over the envelope together in the lamplight, their voices low, adding to the diagram, the conversation moving between them with a fluency and a mutual attention she had not heard between them before. Not the conversation of a father instructing a son, but something more equal, more collaborative, 2 people arriving at the edges of the same problem from different directions and finding that their different approaches fitted together in a way that neither approach alone would have managed. She looked at them for a long time. Then she wrote, "Tonight my father did not look at the fire once. The whole evening he looked at the paper. I think that is the difference I have been trying to name all winter. I don't know yet if it is enough, but it is a different kind of looking, and different is at least something new." January 16th arrived without ceremony, the way most days arrive in Minnesota winter, not dramatically, but with a kind of compressed inevitability, as if the cold had been gathering itself overnight and was now simply present at full strength, requiring nothing further from the world to make its point. Mabel recorded the morning temperature at 5:45 before anyone else was awake, 17 below zero, the same as the day before, which was itself the same as the day before that. This consistency was not reassuring. It meant the winter had found its rhythm and intended to keep it. The journal entry for that day ran longer than most. She described the pit in the floor 4 feet deep, rectangular with rough walls that showed distinct horizontal bands where the character of the soil changed with depth. She described the envelope diagram on the table with her brother's modifications layered over her father's original drawing. She described the sound the cabin made at night when the temperature differential between inside and outside reached its maximum, a low groaning in the timbers that she had learned over 6 winters to interpret not as structural distress, but as the wood simply registering the pressure being applied to it. She wrote day 8 of the project. Father's hands have blisters where the pickaxe handle meets the web between thumb and forefinger. He wrapped them this morning with a strip of cloth cut from the hem of the shirt, too worn to mend further. He did not ask anyone to cut the cloth. He did it himself before the rest of us were up, which means he did not want to be seen doing it. The work of deepening the pit continued through the 16th and into the 17th. With the boiling water method Clara had proposed, and progress was measured in inches rather than feet, but it was progress of a kind that did not require constant renegotiation with the limits of what was physically possible. They reached 4 feet 6 inches by the end of the 16th, 4 feet 9 buff midday on the 17th. Each additional depth brought slightly easier digging. The earth at these levels carrying less of the surface freeze and yielding more cleanly to the pickaxe. And the work developed a rhythm between Elias and Daniel that was almost meditative in its regularity. The strike, the clearing, the water when a new section was begun, the waiting the strike again. Mabel brought them water and took temperature readings at the pit bottom every 2 hours, as recording the numbers in the journal with the same precision she applied to the interior wall thermometer. The earth at 4 feet 6 was 20 below, at 4 feet 9, 19 and a half. The difference was small enough to be statistically dubious, but she recorded it anyway because precision was its own discipline regardless of whether the results were dramatic. It was at 5 feet exactly on the afternoon of the 17th that Daniel's pickaxe struck something that was not earth. The sound it made was flat and final, a sound with no give in it, and Daniel straightened and looked down at the place he had struck, and then crouched and cleared the loose material away with his hands. What he uncovered was the edge of a stone layer, not a single stone that could be pried out and removed, but a continuous shelf of slate-gray rock that extended in both directions as far as he could determine by feel running beneath the pit floor like the deck of something buried there long before any human being arrived to dig toward it. He knocked on it with his knuckles. It returned the same flat sound. He knocked harder. Nothing changed. Elias came down into the pit on the rope ladder they had rigged against the south wall and crouched beside his son, and they both examined the stone together. Elias pressed both palms flat against its surface, as if the quality of the stone might communicate something through contact that it was withholding from the eyes. The rock was continuous, and it was thick, and it was not going anywhere. They could attack it with the heaviest tools available to them and make limited progress at enormous cost in time and physical damage to both the tools and themselves, or they could make a different decision. Daniel ran his fingers along the stone's visible edge and located something useful. The shelf did not extend with uniform depth. It sat shallower on the eastern edge of the pit and deeper on the western edge, meaning the rock was not horizontal, but slightly tilted like a book leaning on a shelf. This told them something. If they shifted the entire pit 18 inches east, they would be digging into a section where the rock sat somewhat deeper, giving them the additional inch or two of clearance they needed to position the stove below the frost line, with enough surrounding material to insulate it properly. The problem was not the digging. The problem was the chimney. Elias and Daniel stood in the pit together in the cold, and Elias said it before either of them had fully worked through the implications. If we shift the pit, the chimney axis shifts with it. We planned the run at 45 degrees, coming off the north side of the firebox and rising through the floor near the northeast corner. If we shift east, the chimney has to travel further north before it turns vertical, and the horizontal run gets longer. He paused. Longer horizontal run means more places for the smoke to lose pressure, more places for it to back up. Daniel was quiet for a moment and then, "We'll have to steepen the angle. Not 45 degrees, closer to 50, maybe 55. More aggressive pitch." Elias looked up at the ceiling of the pit, doing geometry in his head against the underside of the floorboards. "That changes where the chimney exits through the floor, Daniel. Everything moves 18 inches east. We remark the floor and start the new section fresh." They climbed out and looked at the floor. Clara stood in the doorway between the kitchen and main room, watching. She had heard enough of the conversation through the boards to understand the essential fact, which was that the original plan had encountered its first major revision before it was even complete. And revision at this stage meant additional days, which meant additional fuel burned. Maintaining the old stove while the new system was being built, which meant the gap between the available wood and the remaining winter was narrowing faster than the plan had accounted for. She said nothing about this. She went back to the kitchen and put more water on to heat. They dug the adjusted section over the following 2 days, digging faster now, because they had solved the technique and their bodies had adapted to the specific demands of the work. By the evening of the 19th, the pit was at its full dimensions, 5 feet deep, 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, with walls that Elias had begun reinforcing with stones hauled by sled from the collapsed fence line of a property abandoned 3 years prior, half a mile north. The stones had to be fitted against the pit walls with gaps filled by clay that Clara had dug from a depression in the frozen ground along the eastern edge of the property, working with a mattock in the early mornings while the temperature was still manageable, bringing the clay back in a bucket and warming it by the stove until it was workable enough to use as mortar. Her hands were raw within 2 days of this work. She wrapped them in cloth strips and kept going. Daniel asked his father about the thermal medium, the material that would surround the stove itself, once it was lowered into the pit, and Elias explained his current thinking: tightly packed, clay dense and solid to conduct heat from the stove's surface upward through the earth and the floor. Daniel listened to this and said nothing immediately, which was his method of indicating that he had a different idea that he was not yet certain enough of to argue for. He went to the shelf where the books were kept and pulled down the mechanical principles text. His grandfather had left a book so old and well-handled that its spine had been reglued twice, and the cover bore the fingerprints of 3 generations as a kind of reverse archive. He found the chapter he was looking for on heat transfer in industrial kilns used by craftsmen in the Appalachian tradition, and read it again in the lamplight while his father and Clara worked on the pit walls. He read it the way someone reads a text they are trying to make yield something specific, not passively, but with a kind of interrogative intensity, asking the page a question and waiting to see whether the page would answer it. He brought the book to his father that evening, opened to the relevant page, and pointed to a passage about the behavior of heat in kilns, where the surrounding medium was packed clay, versus kilns, where the medium was a mixture of materials of varying density. The packed clay kilns conducted heat efficiently along the surfaces in direct contact with the fire, but the heat stayed in those surfaces rather than distributing outward. The kilns that used a porous medium, a mixture of clay and sand and small stones with air pockets built into the structure, rather than eliminated, showed better radiant heat distribution across the surrounding walls. The heat moved through the porous medium not just by conduction through direct contact, but by convection through the small air spaces, which allowed the heat to circulate rather than accumulate in one place and then stop. Elias read the passage twice. He looked at his son. So packed clay is wrong. And Daniel, with the measured certainty of someone who has checked the conclusion from multiple directions before stating it. Packed clay is wrong for what we need. It will conduct heat into itself and hold it there. We need the heat to move upward through the medium and through the floor. For that, we need the medium to breathe a little. Elias set the book down and looked at the pit and then back at his son and said the thing that was true and that mattered and that he suspected he would remember for a long time. You got that from a book your grandfather owned, and I never once opened. Daniel looked at the book on the table. You were busy with other things. And the stone walls were finished on the 20th. Clara had tamped the final clay into the gaps between the stones with her bare hands, because no tool she had available worked as precisely as her fingers for the narrowest spaces. And when she was done, her palms were cut in 3 places from the edges of the stones. She washed them at the washstand and wrapped them and set the cloth strips out to dry by the stove, and said nothing about the cuts, because they were minor, and because mentioning them would have shifted everyone's attention from the work to her, and the work was more important than her hands. Mabel watched her do this from the doorway of the bedroom, standing just outside the frame, and then went back to the journal and recorded Mother's hands. 3 cuts left, palm, 1 cut right, palm. She wrapped them herself. She did not let Father see. The stove had to come down. 412 pounds of cast iron from the center of the main room to the floor of a pit 5 feet below the cabin floor, through an opening that was just wide enough to allow it passage if the descent was controlled and precise. Elias had been thinking about this problem since the beginning, and the solution he had arrived at was a system of ropes threaded through a wooden pulley block hung from the main support beam above the pit opening. The rope was good rope, not new but sound, save from a previous winter when it had been used for hauling and put away carefully because sound rope was not a thing to waste. He tested the rigging with 200 pounds of stones before he trusted it with the stove. The descent took 50 minutes. Daniel managed the ropes from above, feeding them through the pulley block in controlled increments, bearing the full weight of the stove across his shoulders and hands, while Elias descended into the pit to guide the iron as it came down. The stove moved in short drops and pauses, the rope groaning under the load, the pulley block making a sound like something barely holding. Elias guided the stove away from the stone walls as it descended, protecting both the mortar and the iron from impact, calling up to Daniel when to feed more rope and when to hold. The stone walls of the pit transmitted sound strangely. Daniel's voice came down muffled and amplified simultaneously, as if the pit were both absorbing the sound and reflecting it, so that Elias heard his son's words twice, once clearly, and once as an echo of unclear origin. When the stove touched the prepared sand and clay base, it settled with a sound that Elias felt as much as heard, a deep, definitive seating of tremendous weight, the kind of sound that means something is now where it is going to stay. He stood in the pit with the stove for a moment before calling up for the ladder. The space was crowded with the stove present. There was perhaps 2 feet of clearance on each side and less than 2 feet behind. The air in the pit smelled of mineral earth and clay, and the faint cold metal smell of the iron. The stove was dark and cold and completely still, and Elias rested one hand on its surface and stood in the dark of the pit and allowed himself to think just briefly that this might actually work. The chimney construction took 3 days. Elias built it from the same stone supply, fitting pieces together along the 50-degree angle from the stove's flue outlet upward toward the northeast corner of the floor, where it would emerge and then rise vertically through the roof. The mortar was the same clay mixture, and the precision required was greater than the pit walls had demanded because the chimney had to be both airtight enough to direct the smoke without leaking it into the earth beneath the cabin, and loose enough that thermal expansion from the fire's heat would not crack the mortar and rupture the seal. He had no prior experience building an underground chimney. He had no manual to consult. He built it by first principles and informed intuition, removing and resetting stones when the angle was wrong, grinding clay into the gaps when the fit was imperfect, working in the pit by lamplight, because the pit was deep enough that natural light from above was inadequate. His hands by day 3 of chimney construction were the hands of someone who had been doing something with them beyond their design capacity. The blisters from the pickaxe work had not fully healed before the stonework opened new damage, and the new damage overlaid the old in layers. Mabel pressed her face between the boards and looked down at her father working, and later wrote, "His hands look like they belong to someone else now. Someone who has done nothing but work with stone for much longer than 11 days. The air intake pipe was Daniel's project for those 3 days. He dug the trench for it himself, a narrow channel running from the pit wall northward under the cabin floor and emerging outside through a gap at the base of the north wall. The pipe itself, constructed from segments of hollow wood sealed with clay, angled slightly upward as it moved away from the pit, so that spring meltwater would drain away from the firebox rather than pooling inside the pipe and freezing the following winter. He worked carefully and methodically, checking the angle at each joint with a small level he had made himself from a straight piece of wood and a cup of water. When it was done, it was not beautiful, but it was functional, in the way that things made by people who have understood a problem completely are functional without ornament, without excess, with every element present because it was required. By the morning of the 22nd, the system was theoretically complete. The stove sat in its stone vault. The chimney rose at 50 degrees from the flue outlet to the floor, then continued vertically through the roof to 4 feet above the ridge line. The air intake ran its angled path from outside through the pit wall to the stove's base. The floor above the pit had been replaced and resealed around the chimney's exit point with clay and stone packed tightly into the gap. They had spent 11 days and used approximately $4.60 in materials, which was within Clara's original limit, though that budget had not accounted for the $2 worth of additional rope required when the original rope showed stress fractures after the stove's descent. Clara stood in the main room looking at the floor. The boards looked largely the same as they had before, except for the clay-packed section around the chimney and the slightly different arrangement where the pit boards had been replaced. The room smelled of earth and wet clay. Everything looked ordinary. Nothing below the floor was ordinary. Elias lit the fire at mid-morning of the 22nd. He built it slowly, the way you build any fire in an unfamiliar firebox, small pieces. First tinder, then kindling, then larger pieces added gradually as the initial fire established itself and the metal began warming. The fire caught well. He could hear it through the boards, a muffled, earthbound version of the sound he had been hearing from the stove for 6 winters, but fundamentally the same sound wood, releasing its energy in the presence of air. They waited. 10 minutes. The stove was burning. The draft-pulled Elias had run a thread of raw wool near the air intake to test whether it was drawing, and the wool moved toward the intake the way it should, indicating that air was traveling from outside through the pipe into the firebox and being consumed by the fire. 15 minutes. He knelt at the chimney exit and held his palm 2 inches above the stone. He could feel heat rising. The draft was working. The chimney was pulling. 20 minutes, and he began to allow himself to believe that the first major obstacle had been cleared, and that the second obstacle, heat transfer from the buried stove through the earth and floor into the room, was the next thing that would either validate or destroy 11 days of work. The smoke came at 24 minutes, not from the chimney, from the floor. It came first from a hairline gap between 2 of the replaced boards near the northeast corner, a thin gray thread that he might have mistaken for dust, disturbed by a draft if it had not carried with it the unmistakable smell of burning wood. Then from the gap around the chimney seal. Then from a second hairline crack 2 feet from the first. Within 4 minutes of the first thread appearing, the main room was filling with smoke that moved horizontally rather than rising, spreading across the room at knee height in a gray curtain that made the eyes water and the throat close with the specific involuntary response that the body reserves for genuine threat. He called for everyone to get out. They went through the door in the order they happened to be positioned. Clara first because she was nearest, then Mabel, then Daniel, then Elias, pulling the door closed behind him to limit the air feeding the fire. They stood in the yard in weather that was 12 below zero and breathed air that tasted of cold mineral frost after the acrid chemical bite of the smoke inside, and the transition from one to the other was violent enough that Mabel coughed for 2 minutes before she could stop. Nobody spoke for the first interval. The smoke meant the chimney wasn't drawing with enough force to pull the combustion gases through the underground section before they found other paths. The underground section was too long without enough vertical height to generate the pressure differential the system needed. The smoke had reached the transition from angled to vertical, lost momentum, backed up, and then followed the path of least resistance, which was every tiny gap in the floor above, rather than the long climb to open air above the roofline. Clara stood with her arms crossed and her face arranged in an expression Elias recognized from every instance in their marriage, where something had failed in a way that was expensive and not entirely unpredictable. She was not composing words. She was composing arithmetic, adding up what had been spent against what had been gained, which at this precise moment was nothing. He could see the calculation happening. He could see her deciding not to say it aloud because saying it aloud would not unmake the decision that had led here, and Clara Morrow did not waste energy on the irreversible. When they went back inside and the smoke had dissipated enough to see Elias examine the chimney from every accessible angle, the diagnosis was not difficult. The underground section needed to generate more upward momentum before the smoke reached the vertical rise. The way to generate more momentum was to add height to the vertical section to extend the chimney above the roofline beyond the current 4 feet, giving the updraft more column of hot air above to pull against. He would tear out the current above roof section and rebuild it taller, at least 2 more feet, maybe 3. He would also increase the angle of the underground section from 50 degrees to as close to 55 as the geometry of the pit would allow. He started the next morning. 3 days of work, most of it in temperatures that ranged from 8 below to 14 below, some of it on the roof in a wind that found every gap in his coat with the same thorough patience it applied to the cabin walls. Daniel worked with him on the angle revision, loosening stones, reworking the mortar, resetting pieces at the steeper pitch, while Elias worked above. Clara brought them hot water at intervals and stood watching with an evaluative attention that was not encouragement and was not discouragement, but was something more fundamental than both the attention of someone who is committed to a direction and is now gathering data about whether the commitment was wise, not because there is anything to be done with that data yet, but because she intends to know. It was during this interval on the second day of the rebuild that Mabel noticed her mother's cough. It had begun as a single episode in the early morning of the 23rd, a dry sound brief, the kind of thing that could be attributed to cold air or dust disturbed during the night. On the 24th, there were two episodes. On the 25th, three, and the first one came not in the early morning, but at 11 at night through the wall between the bedroom and the main room where Mabel lay awake tracking temperature readings with her grandmother's thermometer and heard the sound come twice in quick succession and then stop. She lay still for a while after it stopped. She did not get up. She reached for the journal and wrote the entry in the dark mother's cough. Third day, 11 at night this time, not just morning. I know what morning coughs that spread to evening coughs become. Mrs. Erickson, the Halverson boy, I am not going to martyr on the word. I will only say that I am tracking it the way I track temperatures. Every measurement, every time. She did not tell her father. She would carry this information alone for the same reason she understood her mother carried information alone, because releasing it into the family's shared space would force a decision that the family was not yet ready to make, and premature decisions made under incomplete information were the kind that cost more than they solved. The second lighting happened on the 27th. The chimney draft this time was strong and consistent. Elias held a burning strip of cloth near the flue opening before sealing it and watched the smoke travel cleanly up and out. No backing up, no hesitation at the transition point. He rebuilt the fire from scratch, and they waited again. And this time the smoke went where it was supposed to go, and the cabin stayed clear, and the family breathed without difficulty. And for 20 minutes, there was something in the room that was almost permission to believe. Then they began waiting for the warmth, and the warmth did not come. An hour passed. The stove was burning hot. They could feel the faint vibration of it through the floor near the pit area, a deep, almost subliminal trembling. The chimney was working perfectly. The air intake was drawing. The system was operating exactly as designed on every point they could verify from above. The floor was cold. Not the same cold as the surrounding air. When Elias pressed his palm flat against the boards directly above the pit, he could register a marginal difference, perhaps 3 degrees. But 3 degrees was nothing. 3 degrees was the difference between 38 and 41, which was the difference between a room that was cold and a room that was cold in a slightly different way. It was not heat. It was the ghost of heat, the suggestion of heat, heat so attenuated by its passage through the densely packed clay surrounding the stove that almost nothing remained when it finally reached the wood above. 2 hours. Clara set her mending down and pressed her own palm to the floor beside where Elias was crouching and held it there for 10 seconds and then stood up and walked back to her chair without speaking. The silence she sat down into was the silence of someone who has made a final accounting and found the balance irrecoverable. Elias did not look at her. He kept his hand on the floor as if the floor might change its answer if he asked the question long enough. He spent the next 4 days dismantling and rebuilding the clay, fill around the stove, changing density, changing moisture content, adding sand, removing sand, trying configurations that the book on kiln construction suggested, and configurations he invented on his own without theoretical basis beyond the logic of desperation. Some days the floor above the pit reached 45 degrees. On the best day, it reached 47. Each time he reduced the fire to embers for the night, the floor cooled back within 2 hours to its ambient temperature, which meant the system was not storing heat, but only passing it through briefly and inefficiently, and the moment the input stopped, the output stopped with it. Clara managed the household through these 4 days with a precision that had tightened past its normal register into something more controlled and more deliberate. She did not slam things. She did not speak with edge. She moved through the necessary tasks with a kind of smooth, contained efficiency that Elias recognized as the behavior of a person who has drawn inward to a place where they are protecting themselves from the weight of their own feelings by staying in constant motion, because if they stop moving, the feelings will land. He had seen this in her twice before, once during a summer when the crop failed entirely, and they spent August eating through their reserve, and once during a winter illness 7 years ago that she would not discuss afterward. He knew better than to address it directly. He worked and she worked, and the work was the only language either of them had available that said anything that mattered. Mabel's journal entry for the 29th mother's cough is worse at night. I put my ear against the wall at 2 in the morning and heard 4 episodes in 1 hour. Father does not know. I have not decided when to tell him. The project is almost finished. If I tell him now, he will stop the project. If I stop the project, we go back to burning wood we don't have enough of. The math only works one way. I am 14 years old, and I am making this decision, and I am not sure it is a decision a 14-year-old should be making, but I cannot think of another option, so I am making it anyway. It was Daniel who found the answer, and he found it the way useful things are sometimes found, not through directed research, but through the sideways attention of a mind that had been working on a problem below the surface level of conscious thought and had arrived at something. He had been sitting by the kitchen stove in the evening of the 30th, not reading, not doing anything specific, watching the heat come off the iron, in the particular way that radiant heat makes the air above it shimmer slightly when the metal is very hot. He had been watching this for perhaps 15 minutes when the thing he had been trying to identify about the buried system announced itself. He came into the main room and found his father at the table with the envelope diagram and a new sheet of paper covered in modifications and corrections. Daniel sat down across from him and was quiet for a moment, and Elias looked up and waited. "When you stand near the stove in here," Daniel began, "the heat comes to you through the air. The air between you and the stove gets hot, and it moves, and it carries the heat to where you're standing." Elias waited. "Downstairs, you've packed the air out of everything. The clay has no space in it. The heat tries to move the way it moves in air, and it can't because there's no air there for it to move through. So it conducts through the clay instead, and clay conducts slowly, and by the time it reaches the floor, it's lost most of its energy." A pause. "You didn't build an air heater. You built a clay heater. And clay doesn't heat rooms. Air heats rooms." Elias set down the pencil. He looked at the diagram and then at his son, and then at the diagram again, and something shifted in his understanding that was not dramatic, but was complete. The kind of shift that cannot be undone, because once you have seen something correctly, you cannot return to the version of it that was wrong. The clay around the stove was not a medium for heat transfer. It was a barrier to heat transfer dressed up as a medium. Every day he had spent adjusting its density and moisture content. He had been adjusting a thing that was wrong in its fundamental premise, not in its calibration. He had been trying to tune an instrument that was the wrong instrument. The book on kiln construction was already open on the table from the previous day's work, and Daniel turned to the page he had been looking at and pointed to the description of porous medium kilns, the ones that showed better heat distribution because the air pockets within the medium allowed convection to occur. Not just conduction through solid material, but the actual circulation of heated air through the spaces between particles. The heat moved by traveling through those small air pockets, the way it moved through any air rising as it heated, circulating, distributing. The porous medium did not slow the heat down. It gave the heat a way to move. "We need a different material around the stove," Elias said, and Daniel, "a mixture, clay and sand and small stones, not packed tightly, but pressed into place firmly enough to hold the stove stable. Enough porosity for the air to circulate, and then a layer directly under the floorboards that's even more porous, almost loose, so the heat has one final space to pool in before it comes through the wood. Elias, if it's too loose, the stove will shift." "Daniel, we leave the stone vault walls in place. The stove rests on the stone base, not the fill material. The fill is just thermal medium, not structural support." Elias looked at his son for a long moment. Not the look he gave problems when he was solving them, but the specific look he gave things when he was recognizing them for what they were. "Your grandfather would have liked you," he said, and the words arrived without preamble or explanation, as if they had been waiting some time for the right context and had simply decided this was it. The next morning, Clara came to Elias before he went to the pit and opened the ledger and read him the numbers without comment or interpretation, which was itself the interpretation. They had 1 8/10 cords of firewood remaining. At the current rate of consumption, which had not decreased because the buried system was not yet functional, they had fuel for approximately 3 weeks. The winter had approximately 6 weeks remaining before temperatures would reliably moderate enough to reduce heating requirements substantially. The gap between those two numbers was not a projection. It was a fact that had been building since November and had now arrived at a point where it could no longer be absorbed by minor adjustments. She had been carrying this information for 2 weeks. She had not said it aloud until now because she told him plainly she needed him to have enough left in him to hear it without stopping. "You're close enough now," she said. "I need you to know. He stood with this for a moment. The numbers settled into him in the specific way that important numbers settle, not as information, but as weight as a physical addition to what he was already carrying. He looked at his wife and understood perhaps fully for the first time the scale of what she had been managing, in parallel with everything he had been managing, and the two burdens laid beside each other in his mind made the total larger and more precise than either one alone. "You should have told me earlier," he said, and she looked at him with the patience of someone who has already reasoned through the objection, "No, I shouldn't have." And there was nothing in her voice to argue against because she was right and they both knew it. He began dismantling the clay fill that afternoon. He did not hurry. Hurrying would have been a response to the fear, and the fear was accurate. The situation was exactly as bad as the fear indicated. But hurrying would not change the mathematics, only damage the work. He removed the clay fill from around the stove in sections, breaking the packed material loose, with a narrow chisel carrying it up in buckets, leaving the stone vault walls intact. 2 days of removal. 2 days of replacing what he had removed with the layered porous mixture Daniel had specified: clay and sand and small stones in proportions Daniel had calculated based on the kiln chapter mixed in a bucket, until the combination had the right texture, which Daniel described as dense enough to hold shape when compressed, but loose enough that you can feel it settle when you release the pressure. Daniel did most of the actual mixing. Elias did the placement, packing the mixture into the space around the stove in careful horizontal layers, each layer allowed to settle before the next was added. The whole assembly building upward toward the floor with a consistency that required patience. He was running low on, but could not afford to use up. He left the uppermost layer deliberately loose, nearly uncompressed, a stratum of material that had enough airspace to allow the heat rising from below to pool briefly before continuing upward through the floor. Roland Bjork appeared at the cabin door on the afternoon of the third day of this rebuilding, which was the 1st of February by Clara's reckoning. He had heard from a family 2 miles east that Elias had been doing something unusual with the stove, and curiosity had overcome his habitual inclination towards staying in his own business. He stood in the doorway looking at the floor, at the clay-sealed section around the chimney, at the boards that showed the evidence of having been removed and replaced. He asked what was happening, and Elias explained without asking whether Roland wanted to hear it. Roland listened to the entire explanation. He walked to the area above the pit and pressed his boot sole flat against the board and held it there. He crouched and pressed his palm. He looked at Elias. "If this works, does it work well enough that a man could leave his fire low at night without the house going below 40 degrees by morning?" Elias looked at the floor. "That's what it's designed to do. Whether it does it is what I'm trying to find out." Roland stood up and considered this for a moment, and then said the thing that served unexpectedly as more steadying than any expression of confidence would have been, "If it works, I want to know how to build it. If it doesn't work, I want to know that too, so I don't waste time trying it myself." He left shortly after, and Elias stood looking at the door for a moment. There was something clarifying about being held to a standard of result rather than a standard of effort. Roland did not care about the work. Roland cared about whether the answer was yes or no. Elias found this oddly useful. The rebuild was finished on the evening of February the 4th. The floor was replaced. The chimney seal was re-examined and found sound. The air intake was tested. Elias sat at the table and then looked at the diagram that had been modified so many times it was barely recognizable as the original envelope. And he looked at the real thing below him, invisible, buried 5 feet of earth and stone, and carefully mixed thermal medium standing between the fire and the room, and he allowed himself neither optimism nor pessimism, because both were forms of prediction, and prediction was a luxury for people who had not already been surprised twice. That night before she slept, Mabel wrote the last entry before the final attempt. She did not know it was the last entry before the final attempt. She wrote, "Tomorrow, Father, will try again. I have been recording temperatures for 19 days. The lowest the interior dropped overnight was 29 degrees on the 14th of January, when the fire burned too low. The highest it reached with the buried system in both failed attempts was 47 for approximately 1 hour. I am going to record tomorrow's attempt the same way I have recorded everything starting at the beginning, measuring what is actually there, not what I want to be there. The thermometer reads 35 degrees right now. Mother coughed twice this evening before supper and once after. Father held her hand at the table for a moment and then let go and didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything, and I think they have both arrived somewhere past the place where words are the right instrument. The fire is banked for the night. The woodpile is what it is. Tomorrow we find out if the answer is yes or no. Clara woke before the fire on the morning of February the 5th and lay still for a moment in the dark doing what she had trained herself not to do, which was to calculate forward. She had spent the last 3 weeks calculating forward, and the results had been the same each time a line that ran out before the season did, and she had decided sometime in the night, while the cough that had been visiting her for 2 weeks made its rounds and then retreated, that today she would not begin with arithmetic. She would begin with breakfast. She would build the first meal of the day with the same care she brought to everything that mattered, and she would set it on the table and call her family and watch them eat, and she would eat her own portion in full, and she would let the day proceed from that foundation rather than from a number in a ledger. She had been a school teacher, and what teaching had given her, beyond the habit of precision, was an understanding that the order in which you encounter information shapes what you are able to do with it. Her students had needed to trust that the room was safe before they could learn anything the room had to offer. She had understood this instinctively and had organized her classroom around it. She had somehow forgotten it in the weeks since Elias began digging, allowing herself to lead each day with the deficit rather than with the resources still present. And the effect of this was that she had spent those weeks in a state of managed emergency that was necessary but exhausting, and that had taken something from her she could not yet fully name. She got up and made breakfast. Elias came in from checking the barn and found the food on the table, and his wife standing at the stove with a cup of coffee and eating from it with the specific deliberate attention of someone reclaiming a habit they have let lapse. He looked at her plate and then at her face. She met his eyes and held them, and what passed between them in that exchange was not spoken and did not require speech. A mutual recognition that they had both been in a place they did not intend to stay, and that today was the beginning of a different set of decisions, regardless of what the floor below them decided to do when the fire was lit. Daniel came in from the kitchen and ate quickly and without the usual morning quiet, which meant he had been awake for a while and had already shifted into the day's problem. He had slept badly. Mabel had heard him moving at 2 in the morning and recorded it, though she would not mention this to anyone. He had been going over the new mixture proportions in his head, working through the thermal logic again, from first principles, looking for the place where the reasoning might still be wrong. He had not found one. This was either reassuring or the sign of a blind spot he hadn't yet identified, and he had not resolved which it was by the time breakfast was on the table. Mabel ate without her journal, which was unusual. She had left it under the mattress deliberately, as if bringing it to the table would make her a recorder of the day rather than a participant in it. She wanted to be in the room when it happened, not observing from one step removed. This was a small, private decision that no one else knew about and that she would record later along with everything else, but she wanted the first hour of it to belong entirely to her unmediated experience and not to the version she would eventually translate into writing. Elias lit the fire at 9:15. He built it in the same graduated way he had built both previous attempts, tinder, then kindling, then short pieces of split wood added as the base established itself, the flame climbing from tentative to confident over the course of 10 minutes. He did not vary the method. There was nothing in the method to vary. The method was sound. What had not been sound previously was the design of what surrounded the fire, and that design had now been corrected to the best of his ability and his son's understanding, and there was nothing more to change. He fed the fire to a moderate burn, not the maximum heat the firebox could produce, because he wanted the thermal transfer to happen through the medium, rather than overwhelming it, wanted the heat to move upward through the porous mixture in the steady circulating way Daniel had described, rather than pushing through so fast it bypassed the medium entirely and went straight up the chimney. Then he went to the kitchen. This was the deliberate part. He had decided the previous evening that he would not spend the first hour crouching over the floor, pressing his palm against the boards every 4 minutes, because that was the behavior of a man who had not yet learned that watching a thing does not accelerate it. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a piece of wood he had been meaning to smooth for 2 weeks, and he worked the plane across the surface with slow, even strokes and let time pass at its own pace. Clara stayed in the main room. She was mending, or she had the mending in her hands, though she was not working it with her usual efficiency. The needle moved in occasional short runs and then paused while she looked at something in the middle distance. She was not thinking about the fire or the floor or the mathematics of the remaining wood. She was thinking about the morning 6 years ago when she had stood in the schoolhouse in Columbus for the last time before leaving Ohio with Elias, and about the particular quality of the light in that room and the smell of chalk dust and the sound the desks made when the children shifted in their seats. She was thinking about this not because it was relevant to anything immediate, but because her mind had arrived there of its own accord and seemed to need to stay for a while the way a person returns to a place they left before they were finished with it. She had not thought about that schoolroom in a long time. She thought about it now and let herself think about it completely, all the way through until she had finished with it and could let it recede again. At 10:22, Daniel came through the kitchen doorway into the main room. He had been working at the kitchen table and had stood up to get more water and had paused on his way back because something had changed in the quality of the air. He stood in the doorway and looked at the floor and then went to the center of the room and crouched and pressed his palm flat against the boards. He held it there for 10 seconds. 20. He moved his hand 18 inches in the direction away from the pit, held it there. He looked at the floor with the expression of someone who is not yet willing to state a conclusion because the conclusion is too important to state prematurely. He moved his hand again. 3 feet from the pit now. He held it for a full 30 seconds, and then he straightened up and looked at his mother. Clara set down her mending and walked to where he was standing and crouched and pressed her own palm to the boards. She held it there. The floor was warm. Not the ambient warmth of a surface that has sat near a fire for hours and absorbed some heat by proximity, a different warmth, a warmth that was coming from below, rather than from the surrounding air pressing upward through the wood as if the wood itself had decided to participate. She moved her hand as Daniel had moved his, checking the distribution, 18 inches, 3 feet, 4 feet from the center of the pit. The warmth was not uniform. It diminished as she moved away from the pit, dropping from what she estimated as 55 degrees near the center to perhaps 48 at 4 feet, but 48 degrees at floor level, rising into a room that had spent the winter at 35 was not a marginal variation. It was a different room. She called Elias. She did not call loudly. She simply said his name in the same tone she would have used to call him to a meal, a tone without urgency or drama, and he came through the kitchen doorway, and she pointed at the floor without speaking. He crouched beside her and pressed his palm down, and the warmth met him with the same quiet evidence it had presented to her and Daniel, and he stayed crouched with his hand on the floor and did not say anything for a long time. He moved his hand as she had moved hers. He moved it further to 6 feet, then 8, then all the way to the corner where the north wall met the east wall 12 feet from the center of the pit. At 12 feet, the warmth was present but faint, perhaps 3 degrees above the air temperature at floor level. But it was there. It was measurable. It was traveling through the earth and through the wood and into the room in the sustained, continuous way that the porous medium permitted, not as a brief flush of heat that disappeared when the fire was reduced, but as a steady, radiant process that the surrounding earth had begun to participate in the thermal mass storing and releasing at a rate the system could sustain. Mabel came out of the bedroom without being called. She had been tracking the temperature with her grandmother's thermometer lying on the floor of the bedroom, with the instrument pressed against the boards, watching the mercury column move in increments too small to be convincing, and then in increments that were not small at all. She came into the main room holding the thermometer and read the number aloud, her voice steady, factual, the voice of someone delivering evidence rather than announcing victory. 58 degrees. The room was 58 degrees. The interior wall thermometer, which had been reading between 35 and 40 for 6 months, showed a number that none of them had seen on it since October. The family stood on the floor above the buried stove and felt the warmth rising through the wood into the soles of their feet and up through their legs, and the warmth was real in the way that only things are real that you have spent a long time doubting. It had weight. It had texture. It was not the localized aggressive heat of standing within 6 feet of a burning stove, but a distributed ambient warmth that occupied the room the way warmth is supposed to occupy a room, not as the property of one corner, but as the general character of the space. Clara knelt on the floor. She pressed both palms flat against the boards and bowed her head for a moment, not in prayer exactly, though the posture was not entirely unlike prayer. Her shoulders began to move in the small, barely controlled way of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has just been permitted to set it down. The tears, when they came, were not accompanied by sound. They ran down her face and dropped from her chin onto the warm floorboards, and she let them fall without doing anything about them, which was the most complete form of surrender available to her, not fighting the feeling, not containing it, letting it arrive at its full size after the weeks of compression that had reduced it to something she could function around. Elias put his hand on her back and left it there, and did not speak because the moment did not require words, and words would have been a smaller thing than what was happening. Daniel stood back slightly, giving his parents the space the moment required. He looked at the floor. He looked at his hands, the hands that had mixed the thermal medium, that had dug the intake trench, that had managed the ropes when the stove descended. He was not a person given to visible emotion as a general practice, but something moved across his face in those seconds that was not his habitual composure, something younger and less controlled, the expression of a person who has discovered for the first time the specific feeling of having reasoned their way to something true. He looked at Mabel. She looked at him. She held up the thermometer 58 degrees, and the small lift at the corner of her mouth was not a smile exactly, but its structural equivalent. The face's acknowledgement that the world had produced a result consistent with what she had hoped for and contrary to what she had been afraid of. The temperature in the cabin reached 60 degrees by midday and held there through the afternoon. Elias monitored it with the restrained obsessiveness of a man who has been burned by premature conclusion twice and intends to be certain before he is satisfied, pressing his palm to different sections of the floor every 30 minutes, checking the draft at the chimney, listening to the fire through the boards. The system remained stable. The stove burned at a moderate rate, not the full draw they had been pushing through the old cast iron all winter, but a controlled and sufficient burn that the thermal medium absorbed and then released in a steady upward radiation that the floor conducted and the room retained. At 4 in the afternoon, with the fire reduced to a slower pace, the room temperature dropped to 55 and held. At 6, it was 53. The heat was not disappearing when the fire was reduced. The surrounding earth had begun to store it. That night, the family slept in the same rooms they were supposed to sleep in. This was the fact that mattered most, even more than the temperature readings, even more than the fuel projections. The simple restoration of the family to its proper geography. Daniel went to the bedroom he had not been able to sleep in since November and lay down on the mattress and pulled one blanket over him instead of 3 and was asleep within 10 minutes. Mabel slept on her side of the bed and woke once in the night out of habit, reaching for the thermometer before she was fully conscious, and found the floor warm under her hand and put the thermometer down and slept again. Elias and Clara slept in the same bed and woke in the same bed, both of them, without either one having risen to tend the fire, and the morning temperature in the cabin was 52 degrees. Clara's cough, which had been waking Mabel through the wall for 2 weeks, did not appear that night. It did not appear the following night. By the 4th night of its absence, Mabel stopped tracking it in the journal and then wrote instead, "The cough is gone. I don't know if it was the cold that was causing it or whether the cold was simply making something else worse. But the warm room is doing something the cold room could not do, which is allowing her body to stop spending all of its resources on maintaining temperature and start spending some of them on healing. This is not a medical assessment. It is an observation. But I have been observing carefully, and the correlation is exact. The wood consumption dropped within the first week in a way that was almost difficult to accept as real. The buried system required feeding once in the morning and once in the evening, a moderate load each time, and it maintained the cabin at a temperature that rendered the old arithmetic obsolete. Clara did the new calculation on the 6th of February and presented the result to Elias without ceremony. At the current rate, the remaining 1 8/10 cords of wood would last them past the 1st of March, and by the 1st of March, the Minnesota winter typically began its slow concession to spring, with nighttime temperatures rising into the range that could be managed with a smaller fire and a warmer house. The gap between fuel and winter that had been the fundamental crisis of the previous months had closed. Not entirely. There was no margin, no surplus, no comfortable distance between where they were and where they needed to be. But the gap was closable. The line reached the end of the season. Elias spent the following week doing 2 things simultaneously. He made the improvements to the system that he had identified during the failed attempts a secondary air valve on the chimney that could be partially closed to moderate heat output when the surrounding earth became too warm, preventing the clay mortar from drying and cracking under sustained high temperature. And he drew. He spent every evening with paper and pencil making diagrams that were not the rough functional sketches of the original design, but precise technical drawings dimensioned and annotated, showing every component of the system, from the pitch geometry to the chimney angle to the composition of the thermal medium. Clara sat with him and wrote the annotations in her clear school teacher hand when his explanations ran longer than a label could hold. Mabel designed a checklist on a separate sheet, a sequential list of each construction step, with brief notes on what could go wrong at each stage and how to correct it, working from memory and from the journal's detailed record of every mistake the family had made during the 3 attempts. She did this without being asked. She finished it and set it beside the diagrams without comment, and when Elias picked it up and read through it, he was quiet for a moment and then looked at his daughter and said, "This is the most useful thing anyone has made for this project." Mabel looked at the checklist and then at her father and said what was true and sufficient. "I watched everything. I just wrote down what I saw." Roland Bjork came on the 11th of February, which was a Tuesday, arriving in the early afternoon when the temperature outside had climbed to a relative mildness of 4 below, and the snow had the flat, hard glitter that comes when the cold is intense but the sky is clear. He came in and stood in the main room and accepted coffee and pressed his palm to the floor before sitting down, the same testing gesture he had used on his previous visit, and this time the floor met his hand with warmth, and he stood still for a moment and then sat. He drank his coffee and asked 3 specific questions about the chimney angle and the air intake design, and Elias answered each one and showed him the diagrams, and Roland studied them with the reading attention of a man who builds things and understands drawings as a form of instruction rather than decoration. Then he set the diagrams down and said the thing he had come to say. His father-in-law, Per Osterson, was 71 years old and lived alone 3 miles north. And last winter, Roland had spent 4 of the coldest weeks sleeping at Per's cabin because Per's stove was not adequate and Per was not young enough to tend a fire through the night safely on his own. This winter, Per had survived by the same arrangement. Next winter, Roland intended Per to have a system that did not require anyone to sleep on his kitchen floor to keep him alive. Elias looked at the diagrams on the table. The question Roland was asking was not a question about materials or technique. It was a question about whether Elias trusted his own work enough to stake another man's survival on it. He looked at his son across the table, and Daniel, who had been listening without appearing to listen, met his eyes briefly with a steadiness that was its own form of answer. "Come in the spring," Elias told Roland, "when the ground breaks. We'll go up together and I'll show you what the site needs. But I want you and your boy to build it yourselves, not watch me build it. You need to understand it well enough to fix it if something goes wrong in a winter when I can't get there." Roland was quiet for a moment. "That's a harder way to learn it." Elias, it's the only way that's worth anything." Per Osterson arrived at the Morrow cabin 3 weeks later on a morning in early March when the first patches of bare ground were beginning to show on the south-facing slope behind the barn where the snow thinned first. He was a small man, narrowed by age, with the hands of someone who had worked with them for 7 decades in the careful, deliberate movement of a person who has learned to budget physical effort. He had walked the 3 miles from his cabin, which was either a statement of his condition being better than reported, or a statement about the kind of man he was, and probably both. He came inside and sat and refused coffee, which Mabel found interesting enough to record. He looked around the room. He pressed his boot sole against the floor, then his hand. He stayed crouched for a long time, feeling the warmth coming through the boards, and when he stood, his face carried an expression that was not surprise, exactly he had heard from Roland. What to expect, but something deeper than surprise, the expression of a man encountering physical evidence of something he had been afraid to believe until he felt it. He did not say much. He shook Elias's hand when he left both hands gripping and held it for longer than a handshake strictly requires, and the grip communicated everything that the words they had exchanged had not quite reached. Elias stood in the yard and watched him begin the walk back north, moving along the edge of the field, where the snow was packed hardest, a small, deliberate figure getting smaller, and something settled in Elias in that moment that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not pride exactly, because pride was too simple a word for the compound feeling of a man who has solved something that was trying to kill someone he had never spoken to until today. By the middle of March, 7 families in the settlement had committed to building the buried stove system before the following winter. Elias and Daniel spent 3 Saturdays visiting each property, walking the cabin floors, and assessing soil depth and chimney routing, identifying the specific constraints that each site would impose on the basic design. Not every site was identical to the Morrow cabin. One family's floor had a different joist configuration that required a modified approach to the floor reinforcement around the pit opening. Another family's property had a higher water table that changed the intake pipe's drainage angle. Each variation required a site-specific adaptation of the diagrams, and Elias made these adaptations on paper at each visit, adding sheets to what was becoming a working manual assembled from individual cases. The Halverson family, husband and wife, both in their late 40s with a daughter of 12 who had spent 2 consecutive winters with chronic congestion that the doctor in Stillwater attributed to prolonged cold exposure, broke ground on their pit in the 3rd week of March when the soil had softened enough to dig without the boiling water preparation. Elias and Daniel spent a full day at their property. Elias taught and demonstrated. Daniel worked alongside the Halverson son and answered questions that came from someone learning the technique in real time. By the end of the day, the pit was half dug, and the Halversons understood the system well enough to complete it without supervision, which was the condition Elias had established as the standard for every family he helped. He would not build systems for people. He would teach people to build systems because a system you have built yourself is a system you can maintain and repair, and maintenance and repair were what would happen in the winters after this one, when Elias was not available to come and fix what was wrong. The Thomas family, 2 miles east, Garrison, Thomas and his wife Edna, and their 3 children, the youngest 4 years old, had been the family that had nearly lost the youngest to fever the previous January, a fever that the family attributed to the sustained cold of their cabin, and the doctor in Stillwater, when consulted by letter, declined to confirm or deny, but also could not rule out. Garrison Thomas was not a man who warmed easily to new ideas, but he was a man who had sat in a room with a sick 4-year-old for 9 days and understood with the particular clarity that comes from that experience that the available options needed to expand. He built the system himself with his older son, following the diagrams and the checklist Mabel had prepared, coming to the Morrow cabin twice with specific questions and leaving both times with answers sufficient to proceed. When the system was running, he sent Elias a written note, 4 sentences characteristically economical, the last of which read, "The floor is warm, my wife is sleeping." Word moved through the settlement and beyond it in the way that useful information moves in small communities, not through any organized channel, but through the specific intimacy of people who share a climate and understand that the difference between what one family has figured out and what another family hasn't yet figured out is the difference between surviving the same winter and not surviving it. By the 2nd week of April, Roland had become the system's most effective advocate in the northern part of the settlement, traveling between properties with the diagrams under his arm, speaking from the authority of a man who had watched a neighbor's skepticism convert to conviction and who had already broken ground on Per Osterson's system and could report that it was half complete and proceeding without significant complication. He did not oversell it. He said what it was and what it required and what it had done for the Morrow family, and he let the facts carry the argument because the facts were sufficient. Daniel left for Stillwater in the 1st week of April. This had been discussed over several evenings in the weeks since the system's success, and the discussion had been different from what Daniel had anticipated, less resistant, less freighted with the implication that leaving was a form of abandonment. Elias had listened to his son describe what he wanted to learn and had asked questions about the specific trade school Daniel had identified, a 3-month program in mechanical engineering fundamentals that ran from April through June and that several men from the region had attended in previous years. He had asked whether Daniel planned to come back, and Daniel had answered without hesitation, "I'm coming back. I want to understand what we built well enough to explain why it works. Right now, I can tell you it works. I can't fully tell you why not in the terms that would let someone else improve it." Elias had been quiet for a moment and then said the thing that surprised Daniel the most, not permission or approval, but something more precise. "Bring back the vocabulary. We have the knowledge. We need the vocabulary." The morning Daniel left, Mabel walked with him to the road, and they stood at the edge of the property while his breath made clouds in the cold that was already less absolute than it had been a month before. She had given him a copy of the checklist she had made modified to include the variations they had documented from the other properties they had visited. She had also given him, wrapped in cloth, a specific page from the journal, not an original page, but a copy she had made in her best hand containing the full temperature records from the third and final attempt, from the moment the fire was lit to the moment the room reached 60 degrees with every reading and its timestamp. She did not explain why she was giving this to him. He understood without explanation that she wanted the record to exist in more than one place. She watched him walk down the road until the curve of the land took him from sight, and then she went back to the cabin and sat at the table and opened the journal and continued the record. The project had not ended when the floor became warm. The project had changed form. It was no longer a project of survival. It was a project of documentation and transmission, and Mabel had understood before anyone else in the family that this was true because she had been the documentation all along. And documentation only reaches its purpose when it moves from the person who made it to the people who need it. April gave way to May, and Harrow Flats emerged from winter the way it always emerged, not gradually but in a sudden decisive shift. The snow retreating over a few days from something absolute into something vestigial, the ground reappearing with its smell of mineral earth and dead grass, the light changing quality as the sun climbed higher and stayed longer. The change arrived this year, as it had arrived in previous years, but it arrived differently for the Morrow family because they were not arriving at spring depleted. They had wood remaining. They had food reserves that had not been consumed past the emergency margin. Clara had eaten breakfast every morning for 5 weeks. Elias had not lost another notch on his belt after the system began working. These were small recoveries by any objective measure. They felt enormous. Elias spent the warmer months making improvements he had been designing in his head since February. He developed a modified version of the air valve that could be operated from above the floor without descending into the pit, a simple lever mechanism connected by a wire to the valve seat below. Not elegant, but functional, and the functionality was the point. He experimented with variations in the thermal medium composition, testing 3 different sand-to-clay ratios in a small-scale model he built in the yard, measuring how quickly each mixture heated and how long each retained heat after the heat source was removed. He found an optimal range rather than a single optimal formula, which was the more honest and more useful, finding a range within which the system performed consistently, wide enough to accommodate the natural variation in locally available materials. He took notes. For the first time in his adult life, Elias Morrow kept written records of his own work, not the kind of records Clara kept, which were records of what had happened, but records of what he was trying to understand, which was different. He recorded hypotheses that turned out to be wrong with the same thoroughness he applied to hypotheses that turned out to be correct, because Daniel had told him before leaving for Stillwater that the wrong answers were as important as the right ones if you were trying to teach the process rather than just the outcome. He had thought about this for several days before deciding it was true, and then he had restructured his notes accordingly. Clara watched this process with an attention that was not quite the evaluating attention she had applied to the winter's work. That attention had been calibrated for crisis, for the constant assessment of whether the direction being taken was still viable. What she watched now was calmer. She watched her husband in the evenings, bent over his notes by lamplight, working through problems that had no immediate survival stakes. And she recognized what she was seeing, a man doing what he was built to do, not under compulsion, but by inclination, not because failure meant death, but because the work itself had become a form of satisfaction he had not previously had access to. She asked him one evening in June, when the long light was coming through the open window, and the night temperature was mild enough that the window could stay open, why he was still working on something that was already working. He looked up from the notes and then looked at her, and the answer came from a place he had not prepared. The difference between surviving and thriving is what you do after the question of survival stops being the loudest question in the room. She held this for a moment. She thought it was the truest thing he had said in years. She went back to her book and let him work. In July, Roland Bjork reported that Per Osterson's system had been running for 6 weeks since the last cold snap of the season, and that Per had declared it the warmest his cabin had been in 20 winters, which was an old man's rounding up, but was not entirely inaccurate. Per was gardening more than he had gardened in the previous 3 years combined, Roland said, which seemed unrelated until you understood that gardening was what Per did when he believed he had a future worth planting toward. Elias recorded this in his notes not as an engineering data point, but in the margin as a separate category of result, the kind that did not appear in temperature readings or fuel consumption logs, but that was the actual purpose of the whole enterprise. Mabel, in the private arithmetic of that summer, was conducting her own separate project. She had been reading the journals from the beginning, all of them dating back to November, and selecting passages that she judged to be both accurate and sufficiently precise to be useful to someone who had not been present for the events they described. She was not writing a summary, she was writing a record that could stand alone, that would convey to a reader with no prior knowledge of Harrow Flats or the Morrow family what had happened and how and why it had worked. She worked on this through June and into July, revising and condensing, applying the same standards her mother had applied to the household ledger. Nothing included that was not verifiable, nothing excluded that was necessary to the reader's understanding. In late July, she addressed an envelope to a newspaper in St. Paul that published among its regular content a section on agricultural practice and frontier homesteading. She had read several issues of this paper over the previous 2 years, acquired through Roland Bjork, who subscribed and passed his copies along. The section she was addressing was edited by a man whose name appeared at the bottom of occasional longer pieces, and she wrote to him directly explaining that she was 14 years old, which she judged it better to state than to conceal, and that she had documented a heating system developed by her father during the winter of 1887 that had reduced their family's wood consumption by approximately 85%, while maintaining significantly higher interior temperatures, and that she believed the design could be useful to other families in similar circumstances. She enclosed the record she had written 12 pages in her best hand, along with a copy of the primary diagrams annotated in her own words. She sealed the envelope and walked it to the postal exchange in Harrow Flats herself, and came home and told no one what she had done. She recorded it in the journal July 29th, sent the record to St. Paul. I don't know if anything will come of it, but the information exists now in more than one place, which is what information requires in order to survive. No reply arrived in August, none in September. In late October, when the first hard freeze had settled and the buried stove system had been running for 2 weeks with the improved valve and the modified medium composition and a small secondary installation Elias had added in the bedroom that supplemented the main system, a letter arrived from St. Paul. It was not from the editor she had written to. It was from the editor of a different section of the same paper, the section that covered science and technical innovation, who had been given Mabel's submission by his colleague and had read it and wanted permission to publish an edited version of the record, along with the diagrams in an upcoming issue with a feature on practical innovations in frontier homesteading. He requested, if possible, a photograph of the cabin and the family. He also requested Mabel's full name and age for the attribution line, which he intended to include, because he felt the age of the author was relevant to the reader's understanding of what they were reading. Mabel read this letter 3 times, sitting at the table in the warm cabin, and then set it down and looked at the floor for a while. She was 15 by then, having turned 15 in August, and she had been old enough for a long time to understand that the world's willingness to receive what you offered, it was not guaranteed, and that when it arrived, it was not something to receive lightly. She also understood that she was looking at the moment when the thing her family had done became a thing that existed outside her family, when the record moved from the cloth sack under the mattress to a page that strangers would read in St. Paul and in the smaller towns where the paper circulated, and that some of those strangers would be families in cabins. Not unlike this one reading through a winter, not unlike the last one looking for something that could change the arithmetic of their survival. She wrote back the same afternoon. The cabin that winter never dropped below 50 degrees, even on the nights when the exterior temperature fell below 20 below zero, and the wind came off the north field with the particular authority of a winter that has decided to take its full measure. The secondary bedroom installation maintained a floor temperature of 48 degrees in the back room, which was 12 degrees warmer than the room had been at its warmest point the previous winter. Daniel returned from Stillwater in mid-November with a notebook of his own and the vocabulary he had promised to bring back, and he and Elias spent 3 evenings in the first week going through the summer's experimental notes and renaming things accurately, the process Elias had been calling thermal circulation. Daniel could now call convective heat transfer, And the process he had been calling heat spreading through the medium, Daniel could now call radiant conduction, and the precision of the terms did not change what the system did, but it changed what Elias could say about it, which changed who he could explain it to. By December 12, families in the settlement and in the neighboring area had operational buried stove systems. Roland was teaching the stonework technique to 3 men who had never laid stone in their lives. Mabel's published record had produced in the 6 weeks since it appeared 11 letters addressed to her father at Harrow Flats, requesting copies of the diagrams, letters from as far as 200 miles from people who had read the article or heard about it through someone who had. Clara answered the letters in her own hand, enclosing the diagrams and the checklist, keeping a copy of every letter received in a folder she began maintaining specifically for this correspondence. The settlement recorded in the winter of 1887 through 1888 the lowest incidence of cold-related illness in the memory of any person then living there. No one made the connection formally or in writing. It was the kind of fact that existed in the space between what people noticed and what they thought to document, and it would take several more years and a county health record and a statistician from Minneapolis reviewing regional mortality data before the connection was formally observed. But informally, in the way that farming communities hold information about their own history, people knew. They knew that something had changed in how the settlement's cabins related to winter, and they knew where the change had started, and they knew because Roland had told them, and because Per Osterson had told them in the particular blunt way Per said everything that it had started with a man digging a hole in his floor in January and not stopping until the floor was warm. Elias, by December of that year, had stopped describing himself as a farmer who had solved a heating problem. He had not adopted any other description. He was still a farmer. He still grew crops and tended the barn and hauled wood and did the work of maintaining a property against the indifference of climate. But something had shifted in how he moved through that work, a quality of sureness that had not been there before, not arrogance, not the sureness of someone who has stopped doubting, but the sureness of someone who has developed through a specific and costly experience, a reliable relationship with their own judgment. He had been wrong twice before being right. He had understood in being wrong exactly what was wrong and why, and had corrected it. This was a different knowledge from the knowledge of someone who had been right the first time. It was the knowledge of a process, not just a result. On the last evening of that year, the family sat together in the main room after supper. The fire in the buried stove was moderate and steady, and the floor was warm beneath their feet, and the interior thermometer read 57 degrees, and outside it was 11 below zero. Daniel was reading back in his proper chair in the main room, rather than the kitchen floor. Clara had her mending, and she was working it at her normal pace, the needle moving with the quick efficiency that belonged to someone doing something they have done long enough that the hands can accomplish it while the mind is elsewhere. Elias was at the table with his notes. Mabel was at the other end of the table with the journal open writing, and also separately in a different hand, on a separate sheet of paper, composing something that was not a journal entry. She was writing a letter. It was addressed to the preparatory school in Stillwater that Daniel had attended briefly the previous spring, inquiring about their program for older students and whether the program was open to female students, and if so, what the requirements for admission were. She was writing it in the same careful, deliberate hand she brought to everything she put on paper, the hand that made what she wrote look more authoritative than she was certain she had the right to feel. She wrote the letter to its end and read it back and found nothing to change, and folded it and set it aside to be addressed and sealed in the morning. Beneath the floor, the stove burned with the low, steady persistence of something that has found its purpose and intends to fulfill it. The earth around it held the heat as the earth holds everything entrusted to it, slowly, completely, with a patience that has no relationship to urgency or anxiety or the particular human terror of running out. The warmth rose through the stone and the porous medium and the floorboards and into the room and into the family's feet and hands and bodies, and it was not dramatic in the way that crisis is dramatic or failure is dramatic or the moment of first success had been dramatic. It was ordinary. It was the warmth of a room that has been designed to hold warmth, doing what it was designed to do on an ordinary evening, in an ordinary winter, in a cabin at the edge of a small settlement in Minnesota, where a family sat together after supper, and the floor was warm under their feet, and no one was calculating how much longer the wood would last. Clara set down her mending and looked at the room at her husband's bent head, over the notes at her son's open book at her daughter writing with the focused intensity of someone who has somewhere specific to send what they are writing. And she held this image for a moment in the way that people hold things. They understand, are complete in themselves, not a step towards something else, but a thing entire. She thought of the night 47 nights before the digging began, the night she had sat in the chair with the ledger and the numbers that would not balance, and her husband's breathing coming steady and finally untroubled from the back room. She had started every telling of this story there, with that night with the quiet and the cold and the first real sleep. She would start here now, she thought. She would start with the warm floor and the letters and the notes and the room at 57 degrees with the whole winter outside it and nothing inside it that the winter could take. She picked up her mending and kept working, and the needle moved through the cloth with the small, reliable sound of something being mended, and the floor was warm and everyone was home.